I'm excited to dive into this chapter with you where we'll be digging into one of the most powerful controls from Telerik UI for .NET MAUI, the DataGrid. Now let's imagine we want to give our issue tracker a little upgrade. We've got this project backlog list and we want to make it filterable and sortable. This is where the Telerik UI DataGrid has us covered. The DataGrid can handle filtering and sorting, and there are tons of other features to explore. We'll only cover just a few of them, so definitely check out the documentation for what's possible. And you should keep the documentation pages handy and open while using the DataGrid in your own development tasks and as you go through this chapter. You might also want to keep the DataGrid demo project open in another instance of Visual Studio. Think of it as like having a recipe open while you're cooking. We'll kick things off by setting up the DataGrid and configuring it to display our project backlog items. We'll have a look at different column types that are available and how to configure their templates. Then we'll give it a bit of a boost by adding filtering and sorting, making it even easier for users to navigate through the data. So, are you ready to roll up your sleeves and dive in? Let's get started.
We're going to start off by looking at the grid documentation first. Head on over to the doc site and then controls, and then find DataGrid. Here it is. Let's take a look at the overview, and this will give you an idea of what the grid looks like on mobile and desktop. You can see that we have different columns that we're going to specify, but first we need to drop in the grid itself. Just to give you a reminder of what our grid looks like now, if we go over to the backlog page, we actually don't have a grid at all. We have a collection view, and that's fine, but we want to have more capabilities here, which is why we're adding the grid in the first place. What we don't want to change is the functionality. Each one of these rows is clickable or tappable if you're on mobile, and we can navigate to the details. That's what we want to retain, but we want to change this list. So first, let's start with putting the grid in here, replacing this, and towards the end of the chapter, we'll have each row tappable so that it navigates us to the details page. In your project, go to Views, Backlog, and then not the backlog page, we have a special view that actually hosts our collection view, which is called Items View. So open that up, and here it is. This is the collection view that's bound to My Items in the view model, and we want to replace this collection view with a grid. Let's comment this out, and in our content view, we're going to add a grid to contain our data grid. This is, of course, the layout grid that comes with MAUI, not the data grid. The data grid is going to live inside this grid. So it's going to be Telerik rad data grid. And just as usual, we do not have the Telerik namespace registered with this content view yet. So let's add that up at the top here, and now we're good to go. The first thing we're going to need on this grid is to provide the item source. And the item source is actually going to be the exact same binding from the collection view. We're going to bind this to My Items. So let's copy that from the collection view and paste it here as an attribute of rad data grid. One thing that rad data grid is really good at is guessing at the types of fields that you should display based on your collection. Let me show you what I mean. There is a property called auto-generate columns. We can set that to true, and if we look at the grid now, you'll see that we already have something in here. It's a ready-made grid. It's displaying every single property of each PT item, which is the type of item that the My Items collection has in it. For the most part, this is good. We could create a simpler object to bind to, but there are certain things that it's not that good at guessing. For example, it does not know how to display the assignee since it's a complex type of PT user. We also don't want to display tasks, which is a collection, or comments, or IDs. But you get the idea. We only want to display certain columns, so we're going to control that in this chapter. For future reference, if you are working with simpler items, you could just add a data grid like this, and that's all you'll have to do. Pretty neat. All right, in the next lesson, let's start digging into how we can control some column rendering. In this lesson, we're going to start controlling the data grid columns. Right now, our grid has all the columns because it's generating all the columns automatically. But if we turn auto-generate columns to false, well, you can probably guess what happens. Nothing. Nothing is getting rendered here because now we don't have any columns defined. So it's up to us to define the columns. So let's go back here to the code, and we're going to start off by defining a section of where we're going to have our columns defined. It's Telerik rad datagrid.columns. This is where we're going to define our columns. And the first column we're going to define is going to be the title column. By the way, just a little bit of a preview of the types of columns we can define here. IntelliSense is telling me all these different column types are available. Some of these are pretty easy to guess what types they render: Boolean, date, numerical, text, and time. And some of these might not be so obvious. We'll take a look at a few of these. The one we want for our title column is the DataGrid text column. And the most important thing to specify here is the property name, which is title. This is going to render one single column. Look at that. We're pretty much back to where we started off with our collection view now. Notice at the top, the header actually auto-generates the name of the header based on the property name. Sometimes this is good, like in this case, it matches what we want. But sometimes you want more control of that. We can actually specify that by adding a header text attribute. And let's say we want to call it name instead of title. So now we can override that header name with our own title. This is very confusing. Title, name, but I think you get the point here. You can override the header. Okay, this was a very simple one. Let's take a look at another type of column. I'm going to add one for a numerical value, and I'm going to add a header text of estimate. And the property we're going to look at is also called estimate. Now, just to give you a reminder of what our data structure looks like, let's go to core, PT item, and these are the properties of the collection that we're binding to. So here we have an integer that's an estimate. We don't need to do any special conversion here because this type of column knows how to render numbers. So now we have two columns, the name or title column and our estimate column, which is a number. Now, as an exercise, I'd like you to try and render the date created column. If we take a look at the parent of PT item, which is PT object base, you'll see that PT item inherits all these properties such as title, ID, and one of them is date created, which is of type date time. So go ahead and try this out. You can try adding a text column, see how that renders, but there's a special column that you need to use for that. All right, hope you tried that. You might have actually seen that we have a date column here. And yes, this is in fact the one you're going to use. And in this case, it's a good idea to override the header text. Otherwise, it'll be called date created with no space, and that doesn't look so good. So I'm going to call the header created, and I'm going to change this one back to title because, well, it's more consistent that way. And then the property name will be date created. Now you could, of course, use a text column for this, but then you'll need to do all sorts of conversion. Date created automatically knows how to render dates. But not only that, it'll automatically localize it for your region and display it properly based on the region settings of your device. So in my case, I'm in Eastern United States, and we display dates like this, where it's month, day, and year. I know, it doesn't always make sense to display dates like that, but it's using the device settings, and I don't have to do any more work, so I'm pretty happy about that. In this lesson, we're going to look at templated columns. I want to add a column for the type of item of each row, but I don't want to print out the type of item it is, whether it's a bug or a PBI or a chore. I want to display a little icon. These icons are available under Resources, Images, and then we have these icons right here. Here's a bug, here's a chore, a PBI, and then a block. You might think, well, let's just display an image column, but there is no image column. You have to create your own, and you're going to use something called a template column. I'm going to add a template column here. For a templated column, you can also add header text, but I'm going to skip that and just leave that blank because I want this to be a very narrow column and I don't want any text making the column wider. Each template column has to have a cell content template. This is defined by Telerik DataGrid template column and then cell content template. And then inside of that, we need to define the actual data template. Here, we're going to place the image, but the image requires a source. Unfortunately, our item has only a type, which is an item type enum, and it's not going to give us a mapping between the type and the images we want to display. So how do we get a source for the image based on the type of item that it is? Well, in this case, we're going to use something called a converter. I'm going to go up here to the project, create a new folder called converters. I'm going to add a new class, and I'll call this item type image converter. Let's add that. It's going to be a public class, and it's going to inherit from iValueConverter, which means we need to implement this interface, and it has a convert function and then a convert back function. We're only going one way, which is convert, so this is what we're going to implement. Now for each single item we're iterating over, we're going to pass in the item type, And when it comes into this convert function, it's going to be this value. So we need to cast it to item type enum. And now item type will be item type enum. Eventually, this function needs to return a string, which is the source for the image. So I'm going to paste in some code here, which is a switch statement that looks at the item type. And if it's a PBI, we're going to return the PBI icon. If it's a bug icon, and so on. Now we can use this converter. Let's go back to our items view XAML. And at the very top here, we're going to register our converters. We're going to have a few of them here. We're going to register them with the content view as a resource. So we're going to create a content view resources section. And we also need to create a new XML namespace at the top to point to our converters namespace that we've just created. That's this namespace right here, rps.ui.converters. Okay, so now we can say converters, and then Visual Studio helps me out here. It says item type image converter. That's the only one found there. And all we need to do is just create a key for it. That way we can reference it later. I'm going to call this one item type image conv. Okay, so we have a converter which returns us an image source. So now our image can use that converter when we bind to the source. We're going to create a binding here, and we're going to bind to the type. That's this type right here, the type of the item, comma, and the converter is a static resource. Visual Studio helps me out here. We have one defined earlier on the page, and that's the one we just created. So we're going to use that key and send it to the image. Great. Let's check this out. Oh, we do have an image there. That's a good sign, but they're a little bit, well, let's just say they don't fit. So we're going to go back to our image here, and we just need to specify the size for the image. I'm going to say height request is 20 and width request is also 20 because these images are square. And there we go. That's looking pretty good. Each item type is now displayed as a little icon, which is what we wanted. And now it's time to put your skills to the test and do an exercise. You're going to be using converters, you're going to be using DataGrid template columns, and the end result should have a couple more columns, specifically these two, the assignee column with a little avatar of a person and their name, and the priority column, which is a color like this. Let me show you the converters you're going to need. One is an avatar converter that takes in the value of the row, which is a PT user, gets the avatar path, trims the path, and returns the avatar string. All these are resources available under images, avatars, and then males and females. These all have images of the users. Then there's the full name converter, which takes in, again, the PT user and returns the full name. You don't need to do anything with this because it's already a property that exists on the PT user. And finally, there's a priority color converter. This takes in the priority enum and returns a color based on the priority. Give this a shot and we'll review this in a moment. Okay, hopefully you've tried this. Let's go back to items view. This is the completed application, by the way, so you can follow along here as well. And we're going to register the rest of our converters as static resources at the top. Now let's take a look at the actual column definitions. We're going to start off with the priority column. We have a label in there and that's it. We're setting the font size to 9 on the label, font attribute to bold. We are uppercasing text and we're binding to the priority text. We're also centering vertically and horizontally, and we're setting the background color, but here is where we're using a converter. This is the priority color converter. So if we take a look at that column, here's the template column, and it gives us a result like this. Now, the more complex column is also a templated column, and it has its own layout inside of a data template. And this is the horizontal stack layout with its own spacing and margin. The reason we need a separate layout is because inside of it, we're going to have a Telerik red border control. And inside of that, we have a child image. This is the actual assignee that has an avatar. We're using the avatar converter to pull out that avatar from the images. And then we're also binding the assignee and pulling out their full name in a separate label. This also introduces a Telerik red border control, which will give us a result like this. These images are actually square images, but using the Telerik red border, you can get a circular image like this if you wrap an image with the border. You can take a look at the border documentation to see what's possible. So that covers pretty much what you need to know about defining columns. There are a couple of other column types, but those are pretty self-explanatory. In this lesson, let's have a look at sorting. Now, if you played around with this, you might have noticed that this grid is already sortable. If you tap on title, you'll see that sorting is already working. So by default, the grid will already be sortable on certain column types. Title is a text column type, so sorting works by default by sorting alphabetically. Assignee will not sort because assignee is a complex type. Priority won't sort because priority is also a templated column. The grid does not know how to sort that. Estimate is a numeric column, so estimate will sort. And created date is a date column, and dates are also sorted. What if you don't want your data grid to be sortable? Well, you can control the user sort mode. User sort mode can be set to auto, which it is by default, multiple, none, or single. And if you set this to none, this will completely disable sorting. So I'm tapping on title now and nothing's happening. And that may be something you want. We can also control which columns can be used for sorting. So if we describe sort descriptors, we can set a property sort descriptor and we can specify the property name. For example, let's say I only want my title column to be able to sort the grid. I create a property sort descriptor with the property name of title, and now the grid is automatically sorted by title, and I can sort in descending or ascending order or turn sorting off, but can also set the sort order to ascending or descending by default, and we can start with descending, for example. And now whenever we first go into our page with a grid, you'll see that the grid is automatically sorted by title in descending order. You can read on more about this under the DataGrid sorting section and how to control different columns sorting capabilities. In this lesson, we'll talk about filtering. Besides sorting, you might have noticed that the headers of our DataGrid have this little filter icon. These are automatically generated, and if you tap on one of them, they'll allow you to filter the grid depending on the data type. Let's say we wanted to filter the grid by these names. Let's click on filter, and now we're only displaying those 3 items that match the titles that we filtered by. We can go back and clear the filter or click reset, and now all our items will be shown. If it's a numeric type of column, you'll see that our filtering can be controlled either selecting a certain number or a mathematical equation down here where we can set the filter value to be greater than, for example, and now only the higher estimate values show up. Now you might not want to have filtering turned on by default, in which case you can set the user filter mode to disabled. And now the grid will not have any filters in the headers, and this is the type of look you may desire. Now there's one very important piece of functionality that we're now missing because we've converted from our collection view to this grid. And that's going into the details for each one of these items. If I tap on a row, nothing happens. We want to navigate to the details page, and we do that using selection. So going back to the RAD data grid, there's an attribute we can define called selection mode, and there's 3 options here. None will basically disallow any kind of selection. Multiple will allow you to select multiple cells or rows and then act on them, and single will allow you to select just one. And that's what we want because we want to be able to tap on one of the items, go to the details page, and act on one item at a time. So I'm going to set that to single, but the grid currently doesn't know if we want to tap on a cell or if we want to tap on an entire row. So that's where selection unit comes in. We can specify a cell where you can tap on the title cell or the assignee cell and have those behave differently. But I'm going to treat selection by row. So if the user taps or clicks anywhere on the row in any cell, I want the application to navigate to the details page. So I'm going to set the selection unit to row. Finally, I want to act on a selection change, which is an event that's triggered whenever the condition is met by the grid that a single row was selected in my case. So I'm going to define the selection changed, and I already have this method defined in the code behind as onDataGrid selection changed. Let's take a quick look at that. If we go to the code behind, we used to have this onCollectionView selection changed. All it does is call the navigate to details function. And now we have this onDataGrid selection changed method, which also calls the navigate to details method and passes in the currently selected item. This selected item is what we get as part of the DataGrid selection changed event args. Whenever the selection changes, we get passed in those args, and if we have a quick look at what's available there, we'll see that we have an added items collection and we have removed items collection. The reason we have these as collections is to support multiple selection. let's say we select multiple rows or multiple cells, they will be part of the added items collection. And if we deselect some of those, this method would also be called, and there will be some removed items. But that doesn't apply in this situation where we only have one selected item and it's one row. So we are sure that we're going to get the first selected item from the added items collection, and that's going to be the item we're interested in. So now if I go to the grid and tap anywhere on any column of a certain row, I'm going to navigate to the details page for that particular item. And now we've completed the functionality of our backlog page.